The central nervous system is a bit of a mystery in not what it does. We know we have a realization of what our nervous system does, but how it works is a much more mysterious question. We know basics, but we don't know how this tissue makes such complex, or gives us humans such complex abilities. The brain is the biggest mystery of all within that central nervous system. There are 100 billion neurons in the brain. 95% of them are interneurons. It's very organized and complex. And our understanding, although it is pretty cool what we can do or what we can figure out between the different regions, it is very basic. All right, so we'll start with some anatomy of the brain and talk about them developmentally, and then the anatomical structures associated with that. So we can break these up into 5 parts. So this is essentially a 5-week embryo brain. This is what it looks like. You see some differentiation in the different parts and the things that it's going to become, but you don't know, but it doesn't show the complexity, of course, that you would see later in the development. The telencephalon becomes the cerebrum, the diencephalon becomes the thalamus, hypothalamus, mesencephalon becomes the midbrain, the metencephalon becomes the pons and cerebellum, the myelencephalon then becomes the medulla oblongata. So if you expand this figure out from your book, this is the lateral view of this 3 to 4 week old embryo, where you really only have 3 main compartments: the prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon. The mesencephalon remains the same throughout development and becomes the midbrain. The prosencephalon splits into our telencephalon and diencephalon, and the rhombencephalon also splits into the metencephalon and myelencephalon. So these are important regions to know because that helps us understand, where parts of the brain came from. We're just going to go through them structurally and then mention these embryonic origins as we go through them. So we'll start with the cerebral hemispheres, then talk about the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Some general anatomical terms for brain anatomy. A sulcus is a groove. You can see the brain has a wrinkly structure to it. These little grooves then are called a sulcus, or plural would be sulci. And gyrus and gyri are the raised portions or the bulged portions. A deep sulcus is called a fissure. Areas in the brain filled with fluid are called ventricles. And you can kind of see them there. They're found in both the brain and the spinal cord. Nuclei are clusters of gray matter, also called cell bodies. Lobes are areas with similar function, regional separations. And tracts are connections between, generally, these lobes or areas of the brain. And they are myelinated, so they have white matter. So we'll start with the cerebrum, which has 2 large hemispheres, but also has many lobes. In the frontal lobe, there are many different regions. So here's our frontal lobe right here, which are responsible for a number of functions, including thinking, reasoning and concentrating, planning, speaking, which is you'll see later on another picture, a region on the usually the left side of the brain. Premotor, which is learning repetitious skills like playing an instrument, and primary motor, which are voluntary commands. And they are contralateral, so the left part of the brain controls the right side of your body. The parietal lobe divides the frontal lobe, from the frontal lobe by the central sulcus, has the primary somatosensory area, which is involved in touch, pressure, pain, and temperature, and the somatosensory area, which is understanding what you're feeling, so putting that together. And so, sorry, the parietal lobe, then you can see here, these are named after, some of them, after the bones in which they lie under. The central sulcus then divides our primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe and the primary somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe. And the big gyrus that separates them is, the central sulcus divides them, but on one end then you have the precentral gyrus, and the other end the post-central gyrus. And it makes sense that they are close together because you would want your, where you're sensing those things to be directly close to the signals for moving them. A homunculus, that's what this is called right here, which is basically a cartoon or illustrated version where the size of the thing corresponds with how much brain tissue is devoted to that. So a lot of brain tissue is devoted to the face and lips and big toe. Not a lot on the arms and legs. I meant big thumb. Not a lot on the arms and legs, a lot on the tongue. And it's pretty similar in function between the motor and sensory, but there are some slight differences. Okay, the occipital lobe then, moving to the back part here, is important in vision, both the visual association area and the input for that. Now there are some things can happen if you get hit in the back of the head hard enough. You can lose your vision, hopefully temporarily, but it can be permanent. There are also some phenomena called phosphenes, where you're seeing light even though light isn't there. That can happen if you sit up too fast and you aren't getting blood flow to the correct areas of the brain, essentially. Or if you push on your eye, you can basically mechanically stimulate some sort of light. But that's what those are called, phosphenes. All right, the temporal lobe then on the side here is the place where you have your taste, primary gustatory center, and the association of that taste. And closely tied to taste is your olfactory association area, so what you smell. And you also have the hearing association and the hearing involved there as well. So sight, smell, taste, and hearing are all in that temporal lobe. Tracts then are myelinated, so these are white areas within the brain, and they connect different parts of the brain. An association tract runs from anterior to posterior, so you can't really see it very well in this cross section, but from here to there. Between left and right you have commissural tracts, and those are going to go through this structure called the corpus callosum. You see them in green here. And the projection tract then goes from superior to inferior, so these purple ones here. Okay, you may have heard of this right and left brain dominance. It's often referred to when talking about what kind of a personality you may have. Generally, a left brain dominant person is logical and reasonable and does well in math. And a right brain person is more creative and involved in art. It's said that males are more lateralized, meaning they have a dominant hemisphere, and females use both. But is this real? The actual answer is no. And the reason they know that is because studies have been done where they look at use of the brain doing these different tasks, or people that are identified as right-brained or left brain, and their use of their brain is actually equal between the two hemispheres. It is not actually dominant one or the other. But we still refer to this colloquially just to say this person's very left brain. We kind of understand what that means, even though it's not anatomically correct. All right, moving on to the diencephalon, we have a big kind of central gray section called the thalamus in the center of the brain. All sensory input, except smell, goes through the thalamus and synapses there first. And then the thalamus decides where to send it, and then motor commands also go through the thalamus before sending out. So it's essentially a train station conductor type analogy fitting here. It decides, rather than having everything have a direct path to where it needs to be or is sensed, we can have it pass through a thalamus and then make connections, and it's more efficient overall there. Within the thalamus is also the hippocampus, which is where you retain your memories. The hypothalamus then is slightly above the thalamus, and it is involved with mostly survival behavior, instincts, and the pituitary gland is an endocrine gland that secretes hormones, precursor hormones for the onset and continuation of puberty. So it involves, again, kind of these instincts: sex drive, maternal behavior, circadian clock, thirst, hunger, aversion, aggression, temperature, and indicating regulation of the pituitary gland. The epithalamus, so slightly above, includes the pineal gland, and it secretes the hormone melatonin, which regulates your wake-sleep cycle. So here's a graph showing melatonin production in the sleeping hours of the day, and this is comparing young people to older people, and older people have much different sleep cycles than younger people. Maybe it appears that that is due to differences in melatonin. The limbic system is a group of structures together, the thalamus and the hypothalamus, which puts emotions into the emotional context into sensory output. Okay, so it makes sense of all those things together. All right, the metencephalon is considered the motor brain, where coordination takes place, and is the cerebellum is the structure which does that. And this is kind of like, it looks like a smaller cerebrum sitting below and in the back of the brain. But it helps not only with coordination, so moving your right leg and your left arm at the same time in different directions, but also proprioception. So when I lift my arm up, my brain knows that I'm lifting my arm up. I can tell the relative position of my body parts in space and time, and that's done through that as well. And it receives a lot of information at the same time from different sources, so it sorts out which is the most important and which it can trust the most, and helps in sorting out a corrective action for such. So if you trip because you didn't account for that root that was in front of you, it will then, you should be walking forward, but now you're falling. It corrects for that and puts your arms, helps you, sends a signal to put your arms out and so on. And if you think about it, when we exercise, it is a very complicated process. Everything we do is pretty complicated, but especially when we do it at faster speeds. So there's a lot of body parts that need to be coordinated. Your legs have just 5 or 6 different parts, from your feet to your hips, which need to extend in different ways just to move your leg. Your arms as well are kind of counterbalancing what's doing with your legs, as well as your twisting of your body. And then you have breathing and sensory input that is also occurring all at the same time. So the cerebellum handles all this information, makes sense of it, and sends the appropriate signals to the appropriate places so that it works smoothly, or at least as smoothly as possible. All right, so then moving on to the midbrain. This is between the diencephalon and the pons. and is a lot of pretty cool little structures all kind of squished together. Some of the nuclei include the tectum, okay, and this only shows part of it, but here's your superior caliculi, which is part of the corpora quadrigemina. Below this, you can't see it on this, but if you did some sections further down, you would see the inferior caliculi as well. These are important for visual and audible reflexes. So you may hear a loud sound and turn your head. That's what is controlling that in your brain. The red nucleus, which is these big circles here, is the relay for limb flexion. So when you flex something, it's going to pass through the red nucleus. The pons then is part of the metencephalon, and it's wedged between the midbrain and the medulla. And it is composed of conduction tracts. You have longitudinal fibers going up and down, and transverse fibers going from side to side. The medulla oblongata then is below the pons, most inferior part of the brain's stem, and it is very important for controlling your heart rate and your other reflexes, including vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, sneezing, those that have to do with breathing. All right, so that's the brain. Now we're going to talk about the spinal cord. Oh yeah, the medulla oblongata is inaccurately portrayed in the documentary Waterboy. Just wanted to point that out. All right, the spinal cord has a number of parts. We're going to start on the outside. The meningeal layers are protective connective tissue membranes, and they also have blood vessels enclosed within them and sinuses as well. They contain cerebrospinal fluid, and there are three different parts: the dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. These are also covering the brain as well. Sometimes they can be infected and cause what's called meningitis, which would be inflammation of the meninges, which is a very dangerous condition because that can put pressure on the brain and cause death. It can be many different things can infect the meninges. Recently, as in within the past few years, there have been a few meningitis outbreaks. One of them a few years ago was they were able to locate the source, which was a fungal infection in spinal steroid injections. Okay, here's a more complex figure of the anatomy of the spinal cord. We'll look at, kind of break these down into different parts as well. So the spinal cord has a dorsal root and a ventral root. The dorsal root, pretty much all parts on the dorsal part, is afferent information going up towards the brain, and the ventral root is efferent going away from the brain. The ventral root also identifies which part of the efferent nervous system it's a part of, whether it's somatic or autonomic, or which muscle type it's going to, voluntary or involuntary. Okay, so the gray matter there then, again on the dorsal side is going to be all somatic, and on the ventral side is going to be always motor. Okay, sorry, they're both somatic. Ventral is going to be motor, and dorsal is going to be sensory. All right, the lateral horns, which are these projections here. On the dorsal side, it's visceral sensory, and on the ventral side, it's visceral motor. The dorsal horns are somatosensory, and the ventral horns are somatomotor. All right, an epidural is where an injection of drugs is inserted into the spinal cord through the cartilage between your spine and into the outer space where the cerebrospinal fluid or just outside the dura mater may be. And these drugs block the neurotransmitters, which then prevent the nerves from functioning, and essentially just puts them to sleep so you can't feel pain. Is a great tool for birth. childbirth, so people can have a pain-free childbirth. All right, one nervous system disease, which can be very fatal, especially if not treated right away, is rabies. This is a viral infection. It infects a nerve, and then it goes up that nerve into the central nervous system and takes over different parts. Symptoms originally include flu-like symptoms, and then we'll move on to salivation and complete kind of take over the brain, where a person just starts biting and foaming at the mouth. And the reason why they're foaming is because they can't swallow. The actual virus is transmitted through the saliva, so the symptoms it causes actually help it transmit into the next host. But if you think about it, these rabies symptoms are very similar to zombie diseases. So rabies is essentially a zombie disease. Those that were highlighted in the documentary The Walking Dead. This must just be a advanced form of rabies, which causes much more neurological takeover and some pretty remarkable physiological advances in the body, because it's hard to remain undead for that long, in my opinion. Anyway, rabies is a worldwide problem. In higher end countries, it's mostly controlled because pets are vaccinated, but wildlife can still get rabies as well. Generally, raccoons have the highest prevalence and transmission of rabies to humans, but it kills approximately 55,000 people worldwide, and isn't a big threat here in the United States, but in other countries where they have more stray pets or close association with wildlife, it can become a bigger problem. All right, so now we're going to talk about the peripheral nervous system. Okay, this is going to be, of course, not the brain and spinal cord, but everything else, everything coming off of the spinal cord. And there are sensory receptors and motor nerves associated with that. These sensory receptors respond to some sort of external stimuli. And the stimuli have graded potentials that cause an action potential. So if a stimuli is strong enough, it'll cause an action potential, which will send a signal then up to the brain. There are different ways we can classify them. First is by type. You can have a mechanoreceptor, which is caused by a mechanical force such as touch, pressure, vibration, or stretch. Thermoreceptors through heat or cold. Photoreceptors through light. Chemoreceptors through some sort of chemical in solution, maybe in the air or in water. And nociceptors, which are to damage, right? So that's going to pick up pain. Or extreme mechanical receptors. We can also classify them by location. There are some that are close to the external surface of the body, which would be exteroreceptors. Interoceptors are going to be on the inside of the body and include visceroceptors, those associated with internal organs. Or proprioceptors are found in elastic tissues, such as in the bones, joints, muscles, and connective tissue. We can also classify them by their structure. Non-encapsulated have free nerve endings, and these are found abundantly in the epithelium and connective tissue. And encapsulated are also found in similar areas, but they are mostly mechanoreceptors, because that capsule then allows graded potentials to fire or be stimulated when you have a change in pressure mechanically. All right, there are cranial nerves, which go directly into the brain, and then there are other nerves which go into the spinal cord. The cranial nerves have 10 pairs that enter the brainstem and 2 that enter the upper brain. And you'll need to know these 12 and whether they are sensory, motor, or both. and then their general functions. So we'll go over this acronym in order to understand each of these in class. Here they are on the brain: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, so if you'll notice, actually 3, 6, and 12, which are all divisible by 3 around along the middle there. 1 and 2 are big and easy to find. These other ones are a little smaller and harder. We'll also look at these in lab. All right, going back to the spinal cord and the nerves coming out of the spinal cord, we have them following a specific pattern at different parts. All of them have a dorsal root, coming off of that dorsal gray matter, a ventral root, and little rootlets that actually attach into the spinal cord. From there, there is a dorsal ramus, so on the dorsal root. Okay, here's the dorsal ramus here. The ventral ramus, which is going to go in the opposite direction. Okay. And a meningeal branch, which isn't located on here, but that then goes into the meninges. The rami communicantes, and there's 2 of those there, which then go into the ganglion. The dorsal rami supplies somatic regions of the posterior body trunk, which go to the skeletal muscles and skin, and the ventral rami supply the somatic region of the anterior trunk. So they're different parts of the body and the limbs. All ventral rami except the thoracic, in the thoracic region, join together to form nerve plexuses. And so here you go. You have these are the ones in the thoracic vertebrae, and these are ganglion there. All right, so we have our spinal nerves. There are 8 in the cervical vertebrae, 12 in the thoracic, 5 in the lumbar, and 5 in the sacral, and then 1 in the coccygeal. Okay, coccygeal. They're similar to the vertebrae, which we have learned with the bones. Okay, this is mostly highlighting the thoracic ones. Okay, let's see. This shows then the plexuses. And a plexus is where you have all these nerves coming together to form these complex networks, and then they kind of branch off into major nerves. So we have cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral plexus. The thoracic nerves do not form plexuses. The cervical plexus is, most of the branches go to the skin of the neck, ear, back of the head, and shoulder. But one of the major ones that you should know is the phrenic nerve, which goes into the diaphragm. You see that there. All right, the brachial plexus, most of those go into the upper arm, and it's very complicated. See all the branches that come together and then split. But there are 3 regions: the axillary, musculocutaneous, and median nerve, which handle the upper appendages, skin and biceps, and then the forearm and wrist fingers. Okay, the lumbar plexus is in the lumbar vertebrae. Major nerves out of there include the femoral nerve, which goes to the thigh and skins of the legs, the obturator nerve, which enters the medial thigh by the obturator foramen, the big hole in the hip bones, and then goes into the adductor muscles of the inner thigh. The sacral plexus includes this big sciatic nerve, the thickest and longest nerve of the body. A lot of people have sciatic nerve problems. It can cause a lot of pain. And this innervates the hamstring, lower leg muscles, foot, and skin of the legs. Thoracic nerves, of course, don't form a plexus. They form intercostal nerves, which innervate intercostal muscles, skin, and muscles of the abdominal wall. Now, a lot of these nerve patterns follow what's called dermatomes. So the nerves actually go, the parts of the body that go into the spinal cord follow tracks in the skin. And so you can understand kind of which nerve has damage or has something wrong with it based on these dermatomes in the skin. And if there are some infections which will appear across these dermatomes as well, including shingles. Shingles will often show up somewhere in the thoracic region and in a line of blisters along these dermatomes. All right, that's it for central and peripheral nervous system.